This true-life story has been made into several great movies and novels. It is the sad story of Annie Beatrice McQuiston alias Toni Jo, the only woman ever to be executed in Louisiana's electric chair. When her husband was convicted of murder and sentenced to 50 years, she decided to break her husband out of jail. Annie Beatrice McQuiston was born on January 3, 1916, during winter in Shreveport, Louisiana. She was the third of 5 children. Toni Jo came from a family that was, by Southern standards, considered respectable. Her early years were marked by stability. For a time, she lived with her grandmother while her mother was sick with tuberculosis. But tragically, her mother passed away from tuberculosis when Annie was only 6. The dynamic of stable life all changed when her mother's demise. The loss of her mother left a profound void in Toni Jo's life, one that her father struggled to fill. Afterward, she moved in with her father and stepmother, though she often longed to return to her grandmother's care. Overwhelmed by grief, Mr. McQuiston turned to alcohol and was rarely present, abandoning the responsibilities of guiding, supporting, and disciplining his young daughter. Without the structure and the care she needed, Annie was left to navigate life on her own. The absence of parental support led her to seek a sense of belonging and excitement in places and with people who ultimately pulled her off course. Left to fend for herself, she began forging her own path, one that led her down a troubled road and would forever shape her fate. At 13, Annie began working part-time in a macaroni factory, but she was dismissed when the manager discovered tuberculosis had affected her family because he didn't want his employees to be infected with the disease. Following a harsh beating from her father for losing the job, she left home and turned to street life and prostitution, adopting the name Toni Jo Hood, then worked in a brothel within Shreveport's red light district. During this period, Annie developed a cocaine addiction and traveled to other parts of Louisiana and South Texas to make a living. By the time Annie, who is now Toni Jo, was 15, she was already spending time with known criminals. As she grew older, her life took a darker turn. By 20, she was struggling with alcohol and drug addiction and had developed a quick, violent temper. Unable to hold a regular job, she found work in various brothels. The last of these brothels was in San Antonio, Texas, where she met Claude Henry, the man who would become the love of her life. Welcome back to Crime and Prison. Let's take a deep dive into this chilling true crime story of love. This story illustrates how emotions, especially intense ones like love, can take over a person's better judgment. It shows that, under the influence of love, people can lose sight of reality and make decisions that defy logic, often leading to tragic outcomes. For Toni Jo and Claude Henry, their love story became a cautionary tale, a demonstration of how passion, unchecked by common sense, can lead to a downward spiral of self-destruction. At 29, Annie, now Toni Jo, became involved with Claude Henry, a former prizefighter known as Cowboy, whom she met as a client in Austin, Texas. Claude was struggling to make ends meet at the time, but he fell deeply in love with her. Claude Henry was a boxer, but not a very successful one. The closest he ever came to big-time boxing was a fight night in Beaumont, Texas, certainly not the bright lights of Madison Square Garden. In the boxing world of the time, he was considered a palooka, a term for a second-rate fighter. He was rarely booked for matches unless there were no better options available, and his long string of defeats highlighted just how often that proved to be true. Claude Henry was also a career criminal whose life was defined by a continuous cycle of crime and punishment. From a young age, he was involved in illegal activities, and his criminal behavior only escalated over time. With a reputation for theft, armed robbery, and repeated clashes with the law, Henry lived on the fringes of society, constantly evading authorities and showing a stubborn defiance of the rules. Henry's run-ins with the law were frequent and often dramatic. He became known for his bold and reckless actions, relying on quick schemes and impulsive crimes to get by. His criminal record grew longer with each passing year, and his disregard for the law solidified his identity as a career criminal. Despite several arrests and convictions, Henry never seemed to learn from his mistakes. His life was marked by a series of unsuccessful ventures, failed getaways, and narrow escapes. Even when imprisoned, he was notorious for his escape attempts, showing a relentless drive for freedom that often ended in failure. Henry's life was a testament to a rebellious spirit that could not be tamed, but it was also a story of poor choices, desperation, and a deep-rooted inability to break free from a criminal path. However, he did not reveal his secrets to Toni. Toni Jo also might have kept her troubled past and struggles with substance abuse to herself initially. He also did not tell her that he was only out on bail while appealing a murder conviction in Texas. Soon after they met, the brothel madam noticed their budding relationship and quickly called her employee, Toni, and warned her about Henry's dangerous legal situation. "Don't get involved with Claude, Henry," Hattie warned her earnestly. "An entanglement with him will only pull you further down the wrong path." But, like a lost dog ignoring the hunter's whistle, Toni Jo was blind to the danger. Despite Hattie's advice and the clear red flags, she was adamant to continue with Claude. Her heart overpowered her sense of reason, and she became deaf to the voice of caution. She did not care anyway because she was way head over heels in love with him. It was a risk she was glad to take. Soon both of them were on the run from the police. Henry knew it was only a matter of time before the long arm of the law would catch up with him. But he didn't care, he never had. Reckless and indifferent to the consequences, he lived as though the threat of justice didn't loom over him. Together, he and Toni Jo continued their life on the run, hiding from the police and staying one step ahead whenever they could. For them, each day was borrowed time, but the thrill of evading capture fueled their bond, pulling them deeper into a life with no way out. A few months after their first encounter, on November 25, 1939, Toni Jo and Claude tied the knot. They became Mr. and Mrs. Henry. It was a dream come to pass for the couple. Despite their troubled pasts, they seemed hopeful for a fresh start together. After their wedding, they set off for a honeymoon in Southern California, eager to enjoy a brief escape from their complicated lives. The warm beaches and bright skies of the West Coast offered them a temporary reprieve, as they tried to savor the early days of their marriage, oblivious to the challenges that would soon follow. Despite their legal troubles, the two of them continued to enjoy each other's company and living each day as it came. They talked about whether Claude should skip bail, but quickly dropped the idea. They knew that bail bondsmen often worked with bounty hunters or hired help willing to use force, if necessary. So, they decided to wait and see what would happen with his appeal. Unfortunately, things didn't go as they had hoped. While they continued to hope that he would not be rearrested, Claude insisted that Toni Jo go cold turkey to break her drug habit. The process was painful and caused a lot of tension between them, leading to many arguments, both verbal and physical. In the end, though, his tough approach worked, and Toni Jo managed to kick her addiction. As days went by, Claude and Jo Henry appeared to be in a beautiful phase of their marriage. Yet, beneath the surface, Claude's spirit seemed troubled, his thoughts drifting elsewhere. Sadly, their brief honeymoon ended abruptly upon their return to Texas, where Claude was immediately arrested in connection with the demise of Arthur Sinclair. Claude Henry's lawyers managed to get his trial moved to Hondo for a fresh start, hoping the new location might lead to a different outcome. But things didn't turn out in his favor. Henry had been charged with killing a man named Arthur Sinclair, a special policeman, not a full-time officer, but still someone seen as a lawman. Claude Henry was directly responsible for his death during one of Henry's criminal exploits. In a violent confrontation that escalated quickly, Henry's actions led to Sinclair's demise, marking one of the most tragic and serious crimes in Henry's long list of offenses. This incident not only added to Henry's reputation as a dangerous criminal but also brought him deeper into conflict with law enforcement, further solidifying his identity as a career criminal. Henry claimed he acted in self-defense, saying that during a fight with Sinclair, he managed to grab Sinclair's gun and used it to shoot him. According to Henry, if he hadn't done it, Sinclair might have found another gun and shot him in the back. The judge and jury, however, didn't see it that way. Henry was already an ex-convict, and in Texas, taking the life of a lawman was treated as one of the most serious crimes. Many expected Henry to get the death penalty, which would mean execution in the state's electric chair, known as the Texas Thunderbolt, and burial in the Huntsville prison cemetery. Instead, he received a sentence of 50 years in the tough Huntsville prison, which some felt was a surprisingly light punishment under the circumstances. Given the life she led, it was all too easy for her to become entangled with a man like him. In January 1940, just 2 months after their wedding, Claude was convicted and sentenced to 50 years in the Texas State Penitentiary at Huntsville. Toni Jo was devastated. Her marriage had lasted barely 2 months before her husband was imprisoned and convicted. Now, with a 50-year sentence ahead, the reality set in: she would not be reunited with him for decades, if ever. The future they had imagined together was suddenly out of reach, leaving her overwhelmed by loss and an uncertain path forward. The only thought consuming her mind was how to get him out of prison. Her reasoning overshadowed her common sense, blinding her to the risks and the reality of his conviction. She figured it would be a daunting task and needed a partner in crime. Well, it was easy to find an accomplice in the world she lived in. Harold Finnon Burks, also known as Arky or Arkansas, was a drifter with a criminal past and an old acquaintance of Claude Henry. A former soldier who had deserted the U.S. Army. Had left his military service without permission, with the intention of not returning. He was also an ex-convict. Arky was no stranger to trouble. He had already served time in Huntsville prison for burglary. So, when he met Toni Jo, he saw a potential opportunity to make things easier for himself. To Arky, Toni Jo was just another fleeting connection, not someone he felt any particular loyalty toward. When she asked for his help, he agreed, not out of any sense of camaraderie or obligation, but because it seemed like a convenient way to secure a free ride home. For Arky, it was a straightforward exchange, a chance to make his own life a little simpler without much effort. He had no desire to get tangled up in a daring jailbreak, let alone risk facing down heavily armed guards, navigating roadblocks, or evading possess, all for the sake of a casual acquaintance with plans to escape. For Burks, the situation was clear: his involvement was limited to offering a lift, and nothing more. With a plan in mind, he decided to take advantage of her desperation to free her husband, Claude. Arky presented himself as someone with the inside knowledge needed to pull off an escape. He led Toni Jo to believe that he had connections and knew enough about prison life to help her devise a way to get Claude out. To further string her along, he suggested they make a trip to his home state of Arkansas, where they could gather the supplies needed, a car, guns, and whatever else might help them carry out the escape. Toni Jo, consumed by her desire to reunite with Claude, fell into Arky's plan, eager to do whatever it took to free her husband. Arky was the kind of guy she had hoped for. Desperate, she asked if he could devise a plan to free Claude from his unjust sentence. After seeking advice from her criminal connections, Toni Jo came up with a plan to increase her husband Claude's chances of escaping. She advised him to keep a spotless conduct record at Huntsville prison, hoping it might earn him a transfer to a prison farm as a reward for good behavior. The strategy paid off, and soon enough, Claude was moved to a less secure prison farm within the Huntsville system. Now he was working outside the main prison walls, a crucial step that gave Toni Jo hope of finally setting him free. To make the escape a reality, Toni Jo and her partner, Arky, knew they needed resources: money for the journey, civilian clothes for Claude to blend in after his escape, and firearms for protection and intimidation if necessary. According to Arky, a reliable, fast car was also essential to quickly get away once they had broken Claude out. At the core of the operation was a financial need. So, to them, robbing a bank was a shortcut to a potential big cash and quick solution. The two quickly came up with a plan to rob a bank as a quick solution to getting Claude Henry out of jail. They also decided to rob a bank in Harrell, Arkansas. Their plan, though risky and ill thought out, seemed straightforward enough to Toni Jo and Arky. They would hitchhike their way toward Huntsville, relying on Toni Joe's charm and good looks to flag down unsuspecting drivers. When the right car came along, they planned to hijack it, robbing the driver of his clothes, money, and valuables. With the stolen car and supplies, they would make a beeline for Huntsville. Once they reached the prison, they aimed to confront the guards, break Claude out, and then flee Texas, all without being caught, wounded, or killed. They hoped to rely on speed and surprise to get in and out before anyone could stop them. It was a dangerous scheme, but in Toni Joe's mind, it somehow made sense. She was blinded by desperation, fueled by love, and willing to take unimaginable risks. Yet, in reality, the plan was riddled with flaws, foolish and mediocre, and the chances of success were slim. Driven by sheer determination, they ignored the dangers, unaware of just how tragically it would all unravel. Archie had no desire to get tangled up in a daring jailbreak, let alone risk facing down heavily armed guards, navigating roadblocks, or evading possess, all for the sake of a casual acquaintance with plans to escape. For him, the situation was clear, his involvement was limited to offering a lift, and nothing more. Once while passing through Beaumont, Texas, Toni Joe and Archie encountered two young, troubled locals, both with a history of delinquency. Recognizing an opportunity, they enticed the juveniles with the promise of money and excitement, persuading them to break into a hardware store on their behalf. The plan involved the juveniles sneaking into the store after hours to steal valuable items that Toni Joe and Archie intended to use or resell. By appealing to the young men's need for both cash and thrills, Toni Joe and Archie secured their cooperation in the crime, making the juveniles complicit in the burglary while keeping themselves somewhat distanced from direct involvement in the break-in. This calculated move showcased their willingness to manipulate vulnerable individuals to achieve their own goals. Following their plan, Toni Joe and Archie hitchhiked, politely accepting rides when offered, all the while watching for the perfect target. Joseph P. Calloway was on his way in a beaten-down Lincoln Zephyr car to deliver a Ford coupe to a friend when Archie flagged him down while Toni Joe hid behind a tree trunk on the side of the road. She tried to warn him from her hiding place that the car was too rickety for their operation, but Archie didn't hear her. When the driver spotted the hitchhiker on the side of the road, he decided to help. Archie appeared harmless enough, so he decided to pull over and offer him a ride, unaware of the hidden agenda. Calloway had no idea that the seemingly stranded guy had a dangerous plan in mind, one that would soon turn his act of kindness into a life-altering encounter for his family. J.P. Calloway seemed ideal for their needs, his clothes would fit cowboy well enough, he had some cash, and he wore a decent wristwatch that could be pawned for extra money. Most importantly, Calloway was delivering a fast, reliable Ford the 5th to Louisiana, exactly the kind of car they needed for a quick getaway. As the trio drove past Jennings in Louisiana, near the small town of Sulphur, Louisiana, close to a sprawling oil refinery, Calloway's day took a terrifying turn. As they continued on his journey, he suddenly found himself face to face with two loaded pistols, each wielded with clear intent. Toni Joe and her accomplice Archie had set their sights on him, and without hesitation, they forced him into the cramped, dark confines of their car's trunk and proceeded on an unpaved rural road off the main highway and far away from any city or town. Their initial plan was to use the car as a getaway, but they changed their plan. They continued to drive aimlessly for a while, circling around back roads as they searched for a spot secluded enough to ensure no prying eyes would witness their plans. Eventually, they found the isolation they needed, and their captive was roughly hauled from the trunk. As he struggled to adjust his footing, Calloway's hand was crushed when Toni Joe viciously slammed the trunk lid down, injuring him further. Under the threat of their weapons, he was forced to walk into the fields behind a haystack, hidden from the nearby road. There, stripped of any chance for escape, Calloway was ordered to hand over his possessions. Toni Joe wanted her husband to have from his jail uniform once he escaped into a more befitting one to make his escape easy, so she ordered Calloway to remove his cloth and hand them over to her. They took everything of value, his wallet, his watch, and even his clothes, leaving him vulnerable and defenseless. But for Toni, Joe and Burks, robbing Calloway wasn't enough. Archie stayed back in the car while Toni Joe marched Calloway behind the haystack. She compelled him to kneel down and say a prayer while standing right in front of him with the .32 pointed at his forehead. After Calloway finished praying, she shot him point blank between his eyes. Archie heard the sound of the single gunshot and then Toni Joe rushed back to the car carrying Calloway's possession. Archie knew he was in trouble because regardless of who fired the shot, if the cops get them, both of them would be equally guilty of Calloway's demise. In those final, silent moments, they stripped him of his most valuable possession, his life, before abandoning the scene, leaving no witnesses and only the hollow quiet of the Louisiana countryside to mark the tragedy that had just occurred. The pair set off for Archie's home state of Arkansas, reaching the town of Camden 3 days later. That was the initial plan and the reason he agreed to Toni's proposal. But now that things have taken a different turn, he wasn't sure of anything anymore. By the time they arrived, Archie was overwhelmed with fear. The thought of facing the death penalty on top of his other mounting troubles weighed heavily on him. Determined to cut ties with Toni Joe and escape before things got worse, he stuck to his original plan. Late one night, as Toni Joe slept soundly in the rundown motel room they had rented, Archie made his move. He gathered his belongings and slipped out quietly, taking the car, Calloway's watch, and his clothes. Archie's string of poor decisions only grew longer, each mistake compounding the one before. His reckless choices seemed to lead him from one bad situation to another, dragging him deeper into trouble with every misstep. All he left behind were a few crumpled dollar bills and Toni Joe's .32 caliber pistol. Archie knew he was in deep trouble. What had started as minor offenses had now escalated into a life-or-death situation. With his escape, he hoped to put as much distance as possible between himself and the unfolding chaos, but he was fully aware that running might have only worsened his already dangerous predicament. Toni Joe awoke to find herself alone, her world suddenly unraveling. Her accomplice was gone, along with the car, the money, and any semblance of a plan. Panic set in as she realized the gravity of her situation. Clutching the .32 caliber pistol, the murder weapon, still tucked away in her handbag, she made a desperate decision. Without any other options, she fled back to Louisiana, hoping to find some semblance of refuge. Her destination was the only place she could think of, the home of Hattie, a former employer and brothel madam. However, when Toni Joe showed up unannounced at Hattie's doorstep, disheveled and nervous, Hattie's suspicions were immediately aroused. The sight of the pistol in Toni Joe's bag only deepened her concerns. When she noticed that the gun had been recently fired, with a spent cartridge still in the chamber, Hattie pressed Toni Joe for answers. Toni Joe hesitated, but under Hattie's unrelenting scrutiny, she shared her version of events, revealing just enough to convince Hattie that she was in serious trouble. Not willing to risk getting caught up in Toni Joe's problems, Hattie decided to take swift action. She contacted Toni Joe's aunt, who was married to a highly respected officer in the Louisiana State Police. Within hours, Hattie sent Toni Joe off, hoping that turning her over to family might be the best way to manage the increasingly dangerous situation. Toni Joe Henry fled to Shreveport, returning by bus in a state of panic and seeking solace with her Aunt Emma. When she arrived, Toni Joe was visibly shaken and desperate for support. Conflicted and consumed by the weight of her actions, she finally broke down and confessed to her aunt, disclosing the chilling details of how she had killed a man near Lake Charles, Louisiana. Horrified and unsure of how to respond, Emma listened but ultimately felt compelled to tell Toni Joe to stay and not run away. She managed to convince her to stay and wait for her husband's return, assuring her that he would know what to do. For a few tense days, Toni Joe remained in Shreveport, anxiously awaiting the arrival of her uncle, who was away on official business. When he finally returned, Emma reached out to her husband, a Louisiana state trooper, and relayed Toni Joe's confession. He was horrified by the story she reluctantly confessed. As a senior police officer, he knew the gravity of what she had done, and the implications were even more severe because of their family connection. Caught between his professional responsibilities and his loyalty to his family, he faced an agonizing dilemma. The weight of his duty as an officer clashed with the instinct to protect a relative, leading to days of intense soul-searching. Ultimately, his sense of duty prevailed. He knew that the law had to take its course, no matter how difficult or painful it would be. With a heavy heart, he made the difficult decision to fulfill his professional obligation, knowing it meant potentially sending a family member to face justice. To act, fearing for her niece and recognizing the gravity of what she had been told. Understanding the severity of the situation, the trooper moved quickly to have Toni Jo detained, coordinating with local authorities to secure her arrest. Once in custody, Toni Jo faced an intense interview with a Shreveport police officer who questioned her closely about the crime. Initially guarded, Toni Jo soon cracked under the pressure, fully confessing to the murder. She provided specific details, including the location of the victim's body, which allowed investigators to verify her story and solidify their case against her. With this confession on record, Toni Jo Henry faced formal charges, marking the beginning of a high-profile legal battle that would captivate the public and define the remainder of her life. Meanwhile, Archie sold off 2 guns at a pawn shop in Texarkana. The police was tipped off because he fit the description circulating around. But he escaped. While they were still grappling with that, Archie was at another pawn shop in Arkadelphia selling off Callaway's gold wristwatch. He was later arrested in an old house outside Warren, Arkansas. Toni Jo's first trial took place from March 27 to 29, 1940, at the Calcasieu Courthouse. Her striking good looks, combined with the possibility of a death sentence and the brutal nature of the crime, drew intense public and media attention, making the trial a major news story. Throughout the proceedings, Toni Jo claimed that her accomplice, Archie Burks, was the one who had fired the fatal shot, attempting to shift the blame and reduce her own culpability. However, after 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict, sentencing her to death. Toni Jo was not ready to accept her fate. Despite her lawyer's lack of experience and having never handled a capital case before, they launched a defense that rivaled the efforts of the most seasoned and well-paid legal teams. Working pro bono, they mounted a vigorous campaign, challenging the verdict on multiple grounds. They quickly filed an appeal, arguing that the widespread publicity had tainted the jury and unfairly influenced the trial's outcome. Her argument persuaded the court, which granted her a new trial, citing the intense media coverage as grounds for potential bias. One of their primary arguments was centered on Judge Hood's allegedly prejudicial conduct during the trial. Against all odds, and with surprising tenacity, they succeeded. The court was swayed by their arguments and the appeal was granted, overturning her sentence. This decision gave Toni Jo a temporary reprieve and one more opportunity to fight for her life in court. Soon after, Archie also faced trial, where he was convicted and sentenced for his part in the crime. Toni Jo was granted a new trial after a higher court ruled that Judge Hood had mishandled the original case, raising questions about the fairness of her conviction. This decision provided a temporary glimmer of hope, but it also meant that the stakes were higher than ever. In a twist of fate, Archie, who had been scheduled for execution, received a temporary reprieve so he could testify against his former accomplice. Despite the delay in his testimony, it ultimately did little to sway the outcome in Toni Jo's favor. On February 3, 1942, the retrial commenced with Judge Pickrell at the bench. This time, the prosecution was determined to secure a conviction, and the proceedings moved swiftly. Archie Burks took the stand and testified against Toni Jo, providing damning details that cast her in an even darker light. His testimony painted a vivid picture of her involvement, swaying the jury's opinion against her. The evidence was damning, and Archie's testimony only solidified the case against Toni Jo. The jury, unconvinced by her defense, deliberated for less than an hour before delivering a unanimous guilty verdict. Once again, Toni Jo was convicted of murder, and this time, there was no reprieve. Both she and Burks were sentenced to face the death penalty, sealing their fates. Toni Jo was once again found guilty and sentenced to death. Refusing to accept the outcome, she filed another appeal, challenging the conviction and claiming errors in the legal proceedings. Her persistence paid off, as she was granted yet another trial, extending her fight for freedom a little longer. The second trial took place in February 1941. Toni Jo's legal team, undeterred and still working pro bono, managed to overturn the second verdict as well. Their relentless efforts paid off when they filed an appeal on 19 separate counts, arguing that the prosecutor had improperly questioned potential jurors during the jury selection process. Against the odds, they succeeded, and a third trial was granted. The third trial took place in January 1942. It was presided over once again by Judge Pickrell. This trial marked Toni Jo's final chance to avoid the death sentence. Once more, Archie's execution was postponed, allowing him to testify against his former partner for the third time. Despite the mounting legal battles, Toni Jo's lawyers were determined to leave no stone unturned in their fight to save her. Despite her defense team's efforts, Toni was once again convicted and sentenced to death. Determined not to give up, she filed yet another appeal, hoping to overturn the verdict or at least delay the inevitable. With options dwindling, Toni Jo's lawyers managed to secure a temporary stay of execution based on a legal technicality. They argued over the precise wording of a new law that had altered the method of execution. However, the court swiftly ruled against Toni Jo. During the time Henry was being tried, Louisiana changed its method of execution from hanging to death by electrocution. The punishment for murder remained unchanged, while the method of execution had been updated. Her sentence stood firm, and the legal maneuvering that had bought her time ultimately did not change her fate, closing the last door in the legal system. In a final attempt to save her life, Toni Jo's supporters appealed directly to Louisiana Governor Sam H. Jones, requesting clemency. Unfortunately for Toni Jo, the governor rejected the appeal, leaving her without further options and sealing her fate. What made Toni Jo's case particularly peculiar was the surprising level of public sympathy and support she garnered, despite the severity of her crime. Many people viewed her not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a tragic figure, a woman driven to desperation by a combination of circumstances. Some believed that her troubled past, difficult upbringing, and her vulnerable emotional state played a role in her actions. There was also a sense that her initial crime, the murder of Calloway, was the result of her being manipulated by Burks, her co-conspirator. Additionally, her legal team's tireless efforts to secure her release and the dramatic twists in her case kept her in the public eye, fueling the belief that she might be a victim of injustice rather than a criminal. Her case also attracted attention because of the persistent debates over her sentence and the multiple retrials, keeping her in the headlines for years. Moreover, some saw her as a symbol of a flawed justice system, particularly regarding her gender, her socioeconomic background, and the harshness of her death sentence. These factors, combined with a sense of empathy for her plight, contributed to her gaining a significant, though complex, following of supporters who believed she deserved a second chance. During her time at Lake Charles Prison, Toni Jo Henry found an unexpected source of comfort and companionship in Father Wayne Richard, the head of a nearby Catholic parish. Father Richard, known for his compassionate work with inmates, reached out to Toni Jo, sensing the emotional turmoil she was enduring. Over time, the two developed a unique bond, as he offered her both spiritual guidance and the opportunity for redemption amidst her struggles. As their friendship deepened, Father Richard helped Toni Jo explore her faith, giving her a sense of hope and peace that had long been absent from her life. In a profound moment of reconciliation and renewal, he eventually baptized her, symbolizing her commitment to seek forgiveness and a fresh start, even within the confines of her sentence. This connection with Father Richard became a powerful aspect of Toni Jo's final years, offering her solace and an opportunity for inner transformation amid her darkest days. Toni Jo's execution date was set for November 28, 1942, and with the governor, Sam Jones, having already made it clear that he would not grant clemency, her fate seemed sealed. Despite numerous appeals and legal battles, it appeared that no further options remained. Then, just days before her scheduled execution, Toni Jo underwent a dramatic change of heart. Throughout her trials, she had steadfastly maintained that Burks had fired the fatal shot that killed J.P. Calloway. However, in the final moments before her execution, she dictated a statement that completely contradicted her previous claims. In a move that shocked many, Toni Jo took full responsibility for the murder. She signed the statement, which was succinct but powerful, and it read: I, Annie Beatrice Henry, fired the shot that killed J.P. Calloway. It is my hope that Harold Finnan Burks will not have to suffer the death penalty. This sudden admission of guilt, coming so close to her death, left many stunned. It was a final act of remorse, an attempt to absolve Burks from the punishment she believed he no longer deserved, despite the fact that he had played a key role in the crime. Her decision to take full responsibility was an unexpected, and ultimately tragic, twist in a case that had captured the public's attention for years. Then something really amusing happened on the 23rd of November in 1942, Toni Jo Henry's husband, Claude Henry, escaped from Central Prison Farm No. 2. He and another prisoner, Claude Byers, stole a truck and broke through the prison gates, heading toward Lake Charles to stop the execution of Toni, who was facing the electric chair. But how did they think they could pull this off? It was the ultimate act of desperation, driven by panic and emotion. There was no clear plan, no rational thought, just a reckless, spur-of-the-moment decision with no understanding of the consequences. It was stupidity at its peak, and it led to nothing but disaster. Claude Henry's desperation was clear: he vowed to murder the sentencing judge if Toni was executed. As a result, security at Lake Charles Jail was increased, and Judges Hood and Pickrell were assigned armed guards for 24-hour protection. Having read Toni's final interview, Henry felt a deep obligation to save her, convinced that her fate was sealed because of his own actions. He couldn't bear the thought of her execution. Toni, on the other hand, thought his attempt to rescue her was madness. But this concern quickly became moot. Henry was captured just 66 miles away from Lake Charles in Beaumont, Texas, after an alert motel manager recognized his mugshot and tipped off the police. The officers arrived swiftly, broke down the door of his motel room, and recaptured him before he had a chance to escape. Henry was swiftly returned to Huntsville under maximum security, where he would serve the remainder of his 50-year sentence. The South's historical views on women, especially during the time Toni Jo Henry was facing execution, were heavily influenced by traditional gender roles that often casts women in a protective, almost idealized light. Even in cases where a woman had committed a serious crime, such as Toni Jo's involvement in a robbery and murder, there was still a tendency to view her through a lens of chivalry and the concept of Southern ladyhood. In Toni Jo's case, despite the severity of her crime, she was a woman, and there was a societal belief that women, especially those who were perceived as young, attractive, or vulnerable, deserved protection and mercy. This view stemmed from the traditional belief that women, unlike men, were more emotionally driven and less capable of committing crimes with the same premeditation or malice. There was often a sense of moral superiority in the way women were expected to behave, and when a woman fell outside of these expectations, it was sometimes seen as a sign of a tragic failure or a circumstance that could be forgiven with mercy. In Toni Jo's case, there may have been a sense that she was acting out of desperation or emotional distress, particularly since she was trying to rescue her lover, which some might have seen as an act of misguided loyalty rather than calculated malice. This could have prompted people, including those in the South, to view her as deserving of a second chance. The notion of saving her life might have stemmed from a belief in preserving the lady in her, despite her crime, and offering her the mercy that society might not offer to a man in the same circumstances. Moreover, Toni Jo's gender might have made her case more sympathetic in the eyes of some. The South's cultural focus on femininity and purity often led to more leniency for women, as they were seen as inherently more innocent or less dangerous than men. Her crime, despite its gravity, could have been viewed as a result of emotional turmoil or a tragic circumstance, rather than as an act of cold-blooded violence. In summary, the desire to save Toni Joe's life likely reflected a combination of traditional Southern beliefs about the protection of women, a sense of chivalry, and the societal expectation that women, even when they committed crimes, should be treated with mercy and compassion, especially when they were perceived as acting out of desperation or emotional distress. Toni Joe, because they still perceived her as a woman despite her crime. She was allowed one small final concession. Claude Henry was given a single phone call. She urged her husband to serve his time, stay on the right path, and try to make something of his life. She said it was too late for her, but he still had a slim chance at a somewhat normal future. Toni Joe made one last attempt to help Archie by repeating that she had killed J.P. Calloway. However, it didn't help Burks at all. On March 23, 1943, months after Toni Joe's execution, Burks sat in the same chair for a crime he didn't commit, but did nothing to stop. The fatal day arrived. At Lake Charles Jail, a portable electric chair was transported by a truck from Angola prison the previous day and tested. It worked perfectly, just as expected. Louisiana had already executed 5 prisoners using the electric chair since it replaced the gallows in 1940. Toni Joe Henry would be the 6th, but the first woman in Louisiana to be executed, and the 4th person to be electrocuted in 1942. Louisiana's mobile electric chair and its traveling executioner, former Texas lawman Grady Jarrett, were just getting started. All of Toni Joe's appeals had been denied, and Governor Sam Jones still refused to grant her clemency. Toni Joe's head was shaved, but she protested this. As a result, she was allowed to walk her last mile wearing a red bandana to cover her shaved head. On the day of the execution, she had chosen a plain black dress which was brought back from the cleaners that morning in black pumps. She was said to have cried when her head was shaved and had requested and was allowed to wear a brightly colored scarf to hide her baldness. At noon, the execution team arrived at her cell, led by local chaplain Father Richard. Toni had been baptized as a Catholic while waiting for her execution, and he stayed with her until the end. Deputy Sheriff Kenny Reed, who was responsible for overseeing her, stood before her with a somber expression and read the death warrant aloud. He then asked if she had any final words. With a calm and steady voice, she simply replied, "I think not." Taking Father Richard's hand for comfort, she was gently led toward the execution chamber. Though she confessed to feeling nervous and a touch of fear, she remained composed, walking with quiet dignity toward her fate. She entered the death chamber in the basement of Calcasieu Parish Courthouse. She was allowed to pray for a few moments and then Sheriff Henry Reed Jr. asked if she had any last words, to which she replied, "No." She smiled at her executioner and mumbled a few words inaudible to the witnesses as she quickly sat down and was strapped into the chair. The electrodes applied to her shaven head and her calf and a leather mask put over her face. As she sat in the chair, known as Gruesome Gertie, Toni silently prayed, just as J.P. Calloway had done before she shot him between the eyes. With all apparatus set in place, the officer in charge gave a silent signal. At exactly midday the officer gave a silent signal. The last words Toni Joe heard were the now customary farewell, "Goodbye, Toni Joe." The switch was pulled and 2,000 volts shot through Toni's body, lasting only 120 seconds. Her life had come to an abrupt end, just like Calloway's. At 12 minutes past the hour of 12 on the 28th of November, 1942, doctors examined her corpse and confirmed her death. Toni Joe's case was closed forever. Her body was removed a few minutes later. Her last request was that a crucifix be left in her hand when she was buried. Father Richard officiated at her burial at Orange Grove Cemetery in Lake Charles and designed the headstone for her grave. Toni Joe Henry was born Annie Beatrice McQuiston on January 3, 1916. In Shreveport, Louisiana. She died in November 28, 1942, Lake Charles, Calcasieu Parish, Louisiana, U.S. She was just 26 years old. Archie's execution was carried out in March 1943 despite Toni Joe's failed effort to exonerate him. Unfortunately, it was too late. He was executed in the same electric chair she was executed on. No one claimed Archie's body and he was unceremoniously buried in an unmarked grave. Claude, Cowboy, Henry, whose imprisonment had led to the demise of Toni, Joe, Archie and Calloway, was paroled due to his declining health. He was released from prison suffering from heart disease. Just a couple of months after being released, Henry was shot to death by a cafe owner during a brawl on July 15, 1945, in Dallas, a shadow of his former self, with his death marking the end of a senseless and unfortunate series of events. In many ways, his story mirrored that of Toni Joe's, a life marked by poor choices, impulsive actions, and the inability to escape the consequences of a violent, troubled past. His final days were quiet and solitary, a far cry from the desperate, reckless man who had once tried to defy the odds for the sake of love. He was born on the 14th of July, 1913 in Pleasanton, Atascosa County, Texas, USA and died on the 15th of July, 1945 in Dallas, Dallas County, Texas, USA. He was just 32 years old at the time of his demise. I need your help, please. If you enjoy my hard work, then like and share this video, so YouTube can recommend it to other users. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, then do it quickly. Click on the notification bell icon. See you again in the next video with another true story. Thank you for supporting me with a subscription.